Hey there, welcome back. So in this series, we're taking probably going to be a long time working through one of the final and probably the major story in the book of Acts. And specifically, we're looking at the story of Paul's arrest. And we're really asking the question, why was Paul in prison? We know that he was in prison in Rome. He spent 2 years there. From church history, we know that he eventually stood trial before Nero, and then ultimately he was martyred there. But we don't get that story from Acts. But we do know that he was there, and that's where he ended up. So how? Why? Like, what happened that brought Paul to prison in the first place? And so what we've realized is that Paul wasn't arrested and put in prison because he was preaching the gospel. It wasn't that, Paul got 2 years in prison as a punishment for being a Christian preacher. Prison wasn't used for that reason. It was used as a means to hold somebody until trial. So it was just a place to stop them from running away, basically. So that's why Paul was there. But as far as his story goes, he spends 2 years in a Roman prison, and also before that, 2 years in a Caesarean prison. So again, what happened? Why was Paul there for such a long time? What got Paul in that situation in the first place? And the way that Luke tells the story is quite interesting, because he goes into the details of Paul's arrest and what we're going to see today and probably next week, Paul's interrogation. And what we notice is that there's nothing really clear about the circumstance. There's no real clear charge that gets laid against Paul. And really that's part of Luke's point. Luke wants the generation that he's writing this to. Remember, this has been written after Paul's time to a new generation of believers who may not have heard the full story, who may not have realized, or they've certainly heard about Paul, they've read his letters, but they've also heard that he ended up in a Roman prison, that he was martyred under Nero. Of course, that's going to cast doubt over who Paul is and maybe cast a shadow over his legacy. So what we need to find out is what on earth happened. Can we actually trust this guy? So there's an element of that, and probably an element of just a general explanation for Christianity. Christianity by Luke's time is becoming more popular, or it's certainly becoming more well-known, and it's also, there's a lot of cynicism, or there's a lot of sort of skepticism about the nature of these Christians. They don't fit. They don't fit the mold. They cut against the grain. They're at the worst case, they're insurrectionists in the way that they refuse to worship the emperor. So it's something of an explanation of who they are, and to sort of point out the fact that not only are they not a threat, they're actually a net benefit to the society. The way in which they, for the most part, keep to themselves, but also bring a general good to the society. So there's a lot of sort of apologetic elements to the book of Acts, and in part that seems to be what is going on here. That this letter, this story, this narrative is written something as a defense of Paul, probably sometime after his death. So that's what the story is trying to do here, and that's why Paul was there. But what the story again is trying to unfold for us and for this next generation is what actually led up to, what are the details that led up to that imprisonment in the first place. So where we got to last week, Paul he's returned to Jerusalem, and he's come back for the purposes of bringing an offering. He's been gathering this offering up for many years now, and he's bringing that back to Jerusalem, and probably this is going to be his last visit. He's getting quite old at this point, and his plan is to get to Rome and then eventually to Spain, where he's probably going to finish up his life, finish up his ministry. So Jerusalem is at the opposite end of the empire to where Paul wants to go, and so for what he wants to do is to return back there, back to the heartland, bring this offering, and then be on his way. However, when he's got there, as we saw last week, he's been arrested under this false charge that he's brought Gentiles into the temple, or a specific Gentile into the temple, which is the one crime that you can commit as a Jew that you can get you executed by the Jewish authorities. The governor is the one with the sole power of life and death, except in this one instance of bringing a Gentile into the temple, or specifically into the holy area that only Jews can come into. And there's signs outside the gate of that area warning that you can't come in here as a Gentile. And so what they're trying to accuse Paul of is the one thing that they actually have the authority to kill him for. So this is a serious thing they're trying to lay against him. Now, it's obviously not true. Paul never even brought a Gentile into the outer courts. I mean, this is all just throwing mud and hoping some of it sticks. And what makes it more difficult is that the the people who've actually testified to this are not locals. They're Jewish people from the region of Asia, which would mean Ephesus, where Paul has just spent the last couple of years. And so they're people that have sort of finally have their opportunity now to maybe, bring something against Paul and hopefully just eliminate him from the picture. Well, anyway, the mob has turned on Paul. And so what we're trying to figure out now, or at least what's happened now, is that the Roman authorities in Jerusalem have come to break up what was going to be Paul's death by mob violence. He's been beaten by this mob, and the Roman guards, the Roman soldiers who are present in Jerusalem have seen this unfold, and so they've got onto this as quickly as possible, and they've been able to stop this situation from escalating to Paul's death. So they've now to act very quickly because they were right there in the temple where this was taking place. So all of that's happened, and the arresting officer, the tribune of this cohort, a guy by the name of Claudius Lysias. Now he's the one who is trying to figure out what's going on. He's not a judge in this case. He can't take Paul to trial. It's not his job to bring about any sort of punishment for whatever Paul might have done. His job is purely to keep the peace in whatever way necessary, and in the event that somebody needs to be brought to trial, to make sure that happens. So if he sees somebody like Paul who has caused a riot to happen, he's the one who needs to sort out the situation, arrest the person, and then send him to the governor for the governor to deal with the actual criminal prosecution. But before sending him there, he actually needs reason to send him. He actually needs to figure out, who is this guy? What has he done? What sort of charges need to be laid against him? Give something of a starting point for the governor to be able to do something about this trial, to be able to have a basis to work on, to be able to build a case around it. So that's what he's got to figure out. He's got this guy who has been arrested, now, the thing to keep in mind for Claudius as well, he's come into this situation and there's been this mob riot that's taking place, and everyone's shouting and carrying on, but they're all speaking Aramaic. Now, this Claudius Lysias, he's actually a Greek. What we can sort of ascertain from his name and from the fact that he bought his citizenship, we see this later on, what that suggests is that he's probably actually a Greek, and if he has a second language, it'll be Latin. So he'd be a Greek-Latin speaker, which, as we find out, Paul is at least speaking a Greek speaker, but he doesn't speak Aramaic. Now, he might be able to pick up a few phrases. It depends on how long he's been in the region for, but he doesn't need to necessarily know how to speak the local language because everybody has the second language, which is Greek. So when he's dealing with the Jewish authorities, he wouldn't need to deal with them in their local language. And this would be true for the Roman governors. Everybody speaks Greek as a second language, the legacy of Alexander the Great. So he's a Greek speaker. He's coming into Judea, and that would be the language that they would communicate with. So all that to say, this mob has been carrying on and shouting in their local language, which is Aramaic. And so when he turns up and asks in Greek, what on earth is going on? They're all shouting back at him in Aramaic, maybe a few yelling out in Greek, but you can't figure out what's going on. I mean, number one, it's a mob. They actually don't know themselves. They've got no idea. And anyone that might have a clue is going to be yelling at him in Aramaic, and he can't figure out from their own conversations what's going on. So it's all just a mess. He's got no idea what's going on. And all he can see, the only thing he knows is that there's an angry mob trying to kill this one particular person in the middle of the crowd. And so the default assumption would be, well, this guy's probably instigated some sort of trouble amongst the crowd. So he's clearly the one in the wrong here. The locals have turned against this guy, so he must have done something wrong. He's at least the easiest one to blame. Let's figure out what he's done. But the crowds is no good. So the first thing you got to do is just get Paul out of that situation. So stop the crowd from trying to kill him, and then get him aside, get him to somewhere quiet where you can just calm everything down and ask him, what on earth were they trying to kill you for? So that's where we left our story last week. So we'll pick it up in Acts 21:33. We saw this passage last week, but just by way of sort of bringing us back into the story. So the verse 33 says, "Then the tribune came up and arrested him," talking about Paul, "and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another, and he could not learn the facts because of the uproar. He ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the mob of the people followed, crying out, 'Away with him.'" Now, if you look at a diagram of the Temple of Jerusalem, what you notice is that just built off to the side of it is a Roman barracks. And this is purpose-built for housing a Roman garrison, specifically because if there's going to be trouble in anywhere in Judea, it's going to happen in Jerusalem. And if it's going to happen anywhere in Jerusalem, it's going to happen at the temple. And even more specifically than that, it's going to happen at a festival time. And I did a whole series a while ago on the life of Jesus. And what we noticed there when Jesus was arrested, it was at the Passover. Now, Passover being one of the main festivals in a celebration of the time when God liberated them from their Egyptian overlords. In the same way, that's going to be when the Jewish people would expect God to liberate them, and that's going to happen at the temple. And even more than that, that's a time of the year when there's even more people in Jerusalem. People are coming there, doing their pilgrimage to come and celebrate the festival, and they're going to do that back in Jerusalem. Now, so the temple's going to be full of people, it's going to be full of pilgrims, and that's going to be the time when everybody's more riled up and more likely to, start some trouble, and hopefully God's going to intervene. So naturally, the Romans need a permanent presence there, which is quite unusual. So that's the barracks that they're trying to bring him back to, because that's Roman territory. I mean, it's all technically Roman territory, but this is a Roman safe house, or not a safe house, I guess a Roman more barracks, as the name suggests. So anyway, that's what they want to get him back to, and that's where he's going to start to unravel what on earth is going on here. Now, to start today, what we see happening in this story is a series of unfolding revelations. We go from, within a very short space of time, we go from one assumption down one end of the spectrum to a completely different understanding further along. And at every turn, Claudius is having to just have every assumption completely undone almost by the second. And so he sort of walked into this situation. Again, there's a riot happening in the middle of the city. Everyone's yelling out in Aramaic. There's a guy in the middle of it getting potentially killed, and he's obviously has done something wrong, or everybody's angry with this guy. He must have done something wrong. They're all Aramaic speakers. Whoever this guy is, whether he's a local, whether he's a foreigner, we don't know, because there's so many tourists in town at the time anyway. But he's probably, at the best assumption he can make is that the person who is involved in this is just a typical Aramaic-speaking Jew who is of no concern, of no consequence. At the best, he's a local. If not, he's probably maybe someone from the local region. He's nobody of any significance as far as Claudius Lysias is concerned. And so he's just, let's figure out what the situation is and get this guy punished as quickly as possible so that we can all get on with our days. That's about the best that he can probably assume based on the tiny little bit of information that he's been able to gather from his own observation and maybe from whatever the bits and pieces he can pick up from the crowds. All right, so then from there, he's got to get him up into the barracks. And as it says, he has to be carried because of the crowd's violence. They're shouting away with him, which is just a sort of a tip back to Jesus when he'd been arrested, away with him, crucify him. Luke's just kind of recapturing a bit of an echo of that story. And so verse 37, it goes on, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" All right, two prior assumptions have just been either one dispelled and the other one doubt has been cast over it. The first one is the language. Paul, the assumption of Claudius Lysias is that Paul is just a local Aramaic speaker and just a local troublemaker. That's why the crowd hates him. I mean, why would the crowd hate a foreigner, right? He's obviously somebody nearby, somebody from at least within the local area that has been able to stir up such a crowd. So at the very least, he's an Aramaic person, an Aramaic-speaking Jew of no consequence. Certainly not anybody of any significance, and somebody that just doesn't need to be necessarily taken seriously. So that's assumption number one. That has just been dispelled, because when Paul turns around and speaks to to Claudius Lysias, he speaks to him in Greek because he knows that he doesn't speak Aramaic. Paul, of course, is a fluent Greek speaker. Paul was brought up in a Greek-speaking city. And remember, the key thing to keep in mind here is that Paul's not a local. Paul's story is that he was born and raised in Tarsus. Tarsus, as he shows later on, is an important city, but he's a Hellenistic Jew. That means that his primary language is Greek and that he lives within a Greek city, within Greek culture. And what you find in Jerusalem is a Hebraic Jewish culture. That is, that Hebrew is one of the languages, but Aramaic is the primary language. So linguistically, there are differences within the Jewish world, and Paul is of a different kind to what you would typically find around the region. But at the same time, as we remember, Paul had spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. Paul got his main education there. He'd lived there. He was around there at the time of Jesus. He was in Jerusalem during the early persecution. He led the early persecution against the church. So he's familiar with Jerusalem, but his primary Judaism is Hellenistic. He's a Greek speaker by nature. So, of course, he knows that. And so he knows, of course, Claudius Lysias would be a Greek speaker as well, probably recognizing that he's probably a Greek himself. And so is able to knows that that's how you're going to communicate with him. Now, again, the shock for Claudius is that, oh, you're a Greek speaker. Okay, that's assumption number one completely gone. You know, it's kind of like if you meet a foreigner and you assume that they don't speak English and then they speak English, like, oh my goodness, okay, that's, that sort of situation. Anyway, so that changes things a little bit because the local Jews wouldn't speak Greek, or maybe if the ones that do speak Greek would be more educated. The ones that have dealings with the broader world would speak Greek. And the reason why you would learn Greek as a Jewish person living in Judea is that you're more high status, you're more of a metropolitan sort of person. You would have dealings with at least the Roman authorities and certainly with other sort of cultures around you. You're not just some peasant from working out in the fields who only ever learns the local language of Aramaic. You're somebody who's of a little bit more, not necessarily importance, but certainly someone maybe of more wealth, you're a little bit more elite. So that would be your primary reason for wanting to learn Greek. You know, remember when Jesus is traveling around doing his preaching, he's always preaching in Aramaic, and if he knows Greek, it wouldn't be very much because he only ever lived and moved and did his work in Aramaic speaking areas. There would have been no real reason for Jesus to be speaking in Aramaic. So again, the assumption then for Claudius Lysias is that this guy he's gone from being, in my mind, just some local troublemaking, probably a peasant, to somebody who knows Greek. Why would this guy need to know Greek? Who is this guy that I'm dealing with here that he would need to know and be fluent in a second language? So that's different. And Paul probably would have even had a bit of an accent as well. He was a native Greek speaker. And so he would have been able to pick that up as well, probably even as a difference from the local Jewish authorities who would have spoken Greek with their own accent. Paul probably would have had a more Hellenistic accent. So, there's all of that starting to unravel in Claudius Lysias's mind. But then the second, and this is the big assumption that Claudius is leading with, is that Paul is a certain Egyptian insurrectionist that is infamous at the time and somebody who's been on the run for a few years, and that the fact that he led with this, the fact that he says, aren't you this guy? Why would he think that Paul is that guy, except that that's the assumption that he's drawn? Now, quick background to the story. Who is this guy? So a few years prior to this arrest, there had been a sort of Egyptian Jew who'd led an insurrection against the Romans. Now, what he had done is that he gathered a whole lot of followers in Jerusalem, and he said to them, okay, at the given moment, what we're going to do is we're going to leave the city and we're going to form up, create an army, and we're going to come back and we're going to attack the Romans and drive them out of the city. And so people got on board with that. They're thinking maybe this guy's the Messiah. And remember, this is a time when people are still waiting for the Messiah to come. We've had this Jesus guy, but, Romans killed him. We don't take him seriously. So we're looking still for this Jewish Messiah who's going to lead us and raise up an army and lead them against the Romans, drive them out of Rome. That's still the expectation and will be for a long time. So there was a particular guy who had done this Egyptian Jewish guy that they're referring to here. And he had led the revolt and raised up the army, brought them in to attack Rome, and the Romans had completely decimated this whole group. The governor, who was still the governor at this point, the governor Felix, he had basically decimated this group, destroyed them, and unfortunately, the leader, this Egyptian guy, had fled. So he's taken off into the desert, wherever he's gone to, and never to be seen again. Well, anyway, he's still on the run. Now, the Romans don't forget this. They still are after this guy. And until he's captured, this is still a threat to Rome in the local region. So they've certainly got an interest. If there were post offices in and around Judea, in the post office, you would have the wanted sign, and he would be on that poster. So they still want this guy. Now, so Claudius Lysias, he's thinking to himself, I've got him. Clearly, this is what's happened here. This guy has returned to Jerusalem, and his followers have recognized him, and they've wanted to kill him. You know, they've turned against him now because of what he had done a couple of years ago. So Claudius is thinking to himself, "This is great. This is my great victory. I've caught the guy, and I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to send him to Felix, and Felix is going to reward me, and my life is going to be fantastic." It's like winning the lottery as a tribune to be able to capture somebody like this. And so the fact that he leads with this is what he assumes he's done. That's who he assumes that he's caught. And so in one phrase, one question, may I say something to you, has two massive assumptions have been completely dispelled out of Lysias's mind. Number one, that Paul is just some local Aramaic speaking peasant, or just some local nobody that is just easy to do away with. Number one, that's gone. At the very least, there's more to this guy than what I first assumed. He's a Greek speaker. There's something more elite about him. But that secondly, he's not the guy that I thought he was. Now, that would have made things so much easier. If he just was this Egyptian guy, this is a cut and shut, an open and closed case, if that's the right term, and that's it. Got him. And I'm a hero. This has been a great day. Everybody's happy. That's not the case. And so two things have been dispelled, and now we've got an even bigger question of, who is this guy? He's on two accounts, he's not who I thought this guy was. And so now this day has just got a heck of a lot harder, and this situation is going to take much, much longer than I maybe first assumed when I came down into that crowd. So it seems that Paul can even sense a bit of that shock in Claudius. He's, do you speak Greek, and aren't you that Egyptian? Hang on a second. How do we come to that conclusion? He turns around, verse 39, he says, no, he says, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you to permit me to speak to the people. All right. More revelations. Well, the first one's a fairly obvious one. I'm a Jew. Well, you figured that. That's quite obvious. But he's not the Egyptian that he maybe first assumed that he was. Okay, so he's a Jew. All right, that's fine. We get that. But then he turns around and he says, I'm from Tarsus in Cilicia. Now, again, bombshell. Hang on. I thought you were just some local Judean troublemaker, probably peasant, probably just of zero consequence. You're a Greek speaker, but not only a Greek speaker, you're a Jew, but not from here. You're not a local Jew. You're a Hellenistic Jew, but not just any Hellenistic Jew. You're from a major city. You're from a very sophisticated, very, very cosmopolitan, very elite city in the Roman Empire, and even more than that, from a city that's not related to here. You're not even from Judea, and so the jurisdiction of your criminality, yes, you've committed a crime here, if you have committed a crime, but your jurisdiction is actually elsewhere. That's much further north. So Tarsus, if you remember, very, very important trade city, very important sort of city within the particular region of what is now southern Turkey. And most notably about Tarsus is that it's an education city. There's three major education capitals in the ancient world. There's Athens, of course, then there's Alexandria, and then there's Tarsus. So Paul is from a major city and a very sophisticated city. And so it's not just any old Greek city that he's coming from. This is a guy who's come from a significant background. So again, he's gone from within a space of 30 seconds in Lysias' mind, he's gone from being a local peasant to a sophisticated Greek speaking Jew, and certainly not the criminal that I first thought he was, all within a space of 30 seconds. And all of these assumptions being unraveled and rebuilt in some fashion all at the same time. For Claudius, this is just a mess. This is all starting to become very, very convoluted for him. And so he turns around and he says, I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. Now, okay, a couple of things to keep in mind. Paul is not just a Greek-speaking, sophisticated Jew. That's starting to become clear to Lysias. But what Claudius still doesn't realize is that Paul is a Roman citizen. Now, this is an essential detail as this story unfolds. Paul is a Roman citizen, and that brings with it certain privileges. One of those privileges is a right to a proper trial, and most importantly, the protection of the Romans. Now, if Claudius had realized that up front, his whole demeanor towards Paul would be completely different. But Paul's smart. Paul knows how to play this circumstance, and that's exactly what we see him doing. And so right now, Paul's in a situation where obviously, this is not a good situation for him to be in, but the best way for him right now to get out of this is not by the Romans being the ones to bring him out of it, because the Romans can still, they're Romans, right? They do crucifixion. If he can calm the Jewish people down, the Jewish authorities down, to realize, hey, there's nothing really going on here, and then the Jews turn around and say to Claudius, hey, look, yeah, sorry, that was just a misunderstanding. All of this goes away, and we can all just get on with our days. That would be the ideal circumstance right now. So that's what Paul's trying to play out here. And so what he's holding back of his bio so far, his CV so far, is his Roman citizenship, because, well, he's going to use that card later on. That's his literally get out of jail free card. He doesn't want to play that just yet, even though it could be to his benefit. But the only benefit it would be that the Romans would then protect Paul and further entrench the animosity of the Jewish people towards him. So he wants to draw upon the Jewish sympathies and hopefully have them say, all right, this guy's cool, send him away. But he's not going to be able to do that if he's parading his Roman citizenship. I mean, Rome is still the enemy, right? And if you're turning around parading your Roman citizenship, saying these guys are on my side, if you attack me, they're going to come after you. You're not going to make any friends in Jerusalem by doing that. So he's got to avoid that right now. He wants to get the Jewish, particularly the authorities, on side, and the only way he's going to do that is to really accentuate his Jewish attributes, his Jewish credentials. So in order to do that, what he needs to do is to speak to the people. He needs to testify to them who he actually is. And so that's exactly what he's about to do in trying to at least give those guys, I mean, think about the crowd that he's now facing. They're all angry with him. They just don't know why. They don't know. Most of them don't know who he is, and they're all working on their own assumptions. So he needs to at least clarify that and hopefully bring them onto his side so that all of this can go away. So Claudius will be very happy for this to happen. He can maybe get some clarity out of the situation as well. And so, as it says in verse 40, after receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Things just got confusing again. So for the Romans, for Claudius Lysias, he's waiting to hear Paul speak and probably assuming he's probably going to start speaking in Greek. And then, of course, realizing, okay, he's speaking in Aramaic. Now, for the local people, they think that they still don't know who Paul is. And because they don't know him, they're probably assuming that he's a foreigner. They don't realize that he's a local, and certainly the authorities wouldn't. They think he's a foreigner. And so they're probably assuming that Paul is just some Greek-speaking troublemaker from the Hellenistic Jewish regions coming in to make trouble. If a few of them did know him, they know that he's the Hellenistic Jew who's been out there spreading untruths about Moses and the law, and so they don't expect him to be able to speak the local language. What they know about him is that he's a foreign Jew who's been causing trouble in the extended Jewish communities, and certainly not a representative of anything of the local Judaism. So their assumption, again, is that Paul's a sort of a foreign Greek speaker, whereas the Claudius Lysias is like, okay, no, he's not a local Aramaic speaker, he's a Greek speaker, and so everybody's all still in a little bit of confusion. And so then Paul starts to speak in Aramaic, starts to speak in the local language. So all the Jews stop. They're like, hang on a second, he's one of us. He's not the Hellenistic foreign Jew that we thought he was. He's a local like us, speaking our local language. And so suddenly everybody in that crowd can understand him, from the highest to the lowest. All of them can understand what Paul is saying. But unfortunately, Claudius Lysias can't understand him because he's speaking in Aramaic. And so now he's hearing Paul speaking in gibberish. But even more importantly, the guys who are accusing Paul, remember the people that actually started this whole thing are these Asian Jews, these Jewish people from Ephesus. They don't speak Aramaic. They speak Greek. They're local Greek-speaking Jews. They're from a different area like Paul is. They haven't, and probably haven't had the luxury of being raised as Paul was in Jerusalem, where he would have learnt Aramaic. So they've got no idea what he's saying. So actually what Paul is really demonstrating here is that he's actually more local than they are. The guys who are bringing the accusation are actually more foreigners than he is, because as he's going to reveal to them later on, he was born and raised, he grew up in Jerusalem. He's more local than those guys. So now he's brought the Jewish crowd at least to silence. They're at least giving him a hearing, because hang on, you can't speak our language unless there's something more local about you. So and all of their assumptions have been dissipated. Unfortunately, again, you got to picture this whole time. Paul's standing up on a set of steps and he's overlooking a big angry crowd. Standing next to him is Claudius, the Roman, who's looking at him going, well, you're not what I thought you were, and now you're giving some sort of defense in a language that I can't understand, so I can't figure out. So I'm going to have to ask you about this later on. And he can't even turn to if the Asian Jews are even there, to be able to say to those guys, what's this guy saying? Because, well, they don't understand him either. So the crowd then is realizing, all right, he's not necessarily, if he is a Hellenistic Jew, he's at least somewhat localized, and he's also not maybe as Roman as we thought we thought he was, because again, he's speaking in the local language. So at least everyone's silent. At least Paul has a captive audience to be able to give something of a defense of who he is. So he goes on in his story, verse 3, he says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city. If you remember from Paul's testimony, he was born and raised in Tarsus, where he would have received something of his early education. But when it came time for his sort of high school and university education, his parents brought him to Jerusalem, and that's where he was trained to be a Pharisee. So he would have spent at least most of his teen years, and certainly into his 20s, he would have spent in Jerusalem. He would have been around in the time of Jesus' arrest. He may have even been at the trial. I mean, he was very, very local, and we can tell, we know that he was around during Jesus' time, because very shortly after, when his disciples were being persecuted, they were being persecuted by Saul of Tarsus. So he was clearly around the city when during that time. So he's had a lot of time. His sort of early adult years were spent in the local area. So he's kind of walks in both worlds. Clearly he's a Greek speaker, but he's also a local as well, an Aramaic speaker. So that's at least going to get some attention. Now, thinking about, again, these people who he's speaking to are obviously the locals, and the majority of them would be from around the area of Jerusalem. So the fact that Paul can appeal to them and say, I have been raised here in this city, at least builds some more rapport between him and the audience than even his accusers would, because they're only there as pilgrims. Paul's like, no, I lived here for a very long time. I'm very local, and I consider this home. So at least that's going to build something of a rapport. That's going to give him at least something of a listening audience. So he goes on, he says, I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. So if there are any sense of the accusation against Paul, it's that he is an apostate, that he's somebody who's out there spreading or denigrating the law of Moses, telling people that they need to turn away from Moses, turn away from the law. Remember, that's been the original accusation. So what's Paul's defense? He's like, no. I was trained here. I was trained in the law in this place, and not just by any teacher. I was trained by Gamaliel. Now, why would he name drop Gamaliel? Well, Gamaliel was the greatest teacher of the generation. He was, and still is, one of the most famous rabbis of all of Jewish history. And so, and the thing about being a student of Gamaliel, it's not like you go to. It's not going to a university where you sign up for the university and you get accepted. And you're sort of part of a bigger institution. No, the teacher has to personally pick you. You study directly under. In the same way that Jesus goes out and calls the disciples, Gamaliel would have chosen Paul as a student. And if you're the best teacher of the generation, you're not going to just take anyone who applies. You're going to take the best. You're going to vet the very best of the students that are available. And there would be plenty because everyone wants to study with the best. So that would even indicate something of the quality or the character and intelligence of Paul, that he would be selected by Gamaliel in the first place. It takes one to know one sort of thing. So the fact that he's name dropping Gamaliel is really, really significant here. This is a big mark in Paul's positive box here, in the sense that, not only am I a local, not only was I trained here, I was trained here by the best. If anyone knows the law, it's me. And I was as zealous as any of you are for the law as a result of that training. So I am as local as you are. I am as passionate about the law as you are. So let's at least dispel that ridiculous notion that I'm anti-law, anti-Moses. No, I was trained in that law by the best of the best. Verse 4, he says, I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women, throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. So I was passionate about the law to the extent that I was actually persecuting the members of this particular way. Everyone knows that I'm a follower of the way, that I'm a Christian, as some of you might call me. A lot's changed. Now, thinking this is the year about 57, 58 when this is occurring. Paul had left Jerusalem. Paul was doing his persecution back in about 34, 35. So we're talking about 23, 24 years has passed since Paul was doing his persecuting. So that's a long time, but there'd still be people around that would have memories of Paul. There would still be witnesses of Paul, or at the very least, people that had heard about who this great Saul the persecutor was. That would still be common knowledge. And so he can say, look, you can testify, you can find witnesses that would verify how passionate I was, to the extent that I was actively persecuting the followers of this way. Yes, I'm a member of it now, that circumstances changed. But to give you an idea of my starting point, I wasn't just any old local. I was right up there with the authorities, maybe even a member of the Sanhedrin, and certainly to the extent that I was doing this persecution. So I'm a pretty serious person when it comes to this, and whatever assumptions you might have about how much of an apostate I am, you can dispel them. I'm not what you think I am in that regard. And so then I'll take a lot of the story out because we don't necessarily need to read it. But what Paul goes on to talk about now is his testimony. So he's trying to build that bridge to say, look, I was like you, right? I was very much opposed to this movement, and that was me, and I was the leader of that. I mean, you want to bet if you want some sort of exemplar of what it looks like to hate Christians, I'm Exhibit A. That was me. But then he goes and talk about his testimony, remembering that the other accusation against Paul is that he is telling everybody to turn away from Moses, right? He's telling everyone to turn away from the law, stop circumcising your kids, and that he's anti-scripture, anti-Yahweh in that regard. And so what Paul goes on to talk about is his testimony about Christ, what he discovered in Christ, which is that Christ actually is the Messiah. And so it's not only is he not a anti-law, he's actually the chief proponent of the law. Paul's whole message is that the law has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. That is Paul's entire message. That's his whole gospel. And so it's not only is he not against the law, he's fully on board with the law. In fact, he uses the law to teach about Christ. Keeping in mind when Paul's establishing his churches, he doesn't have a New Testament. Well, they haven't written that yet. Paul's still living out the New Testament. So when he's out there teaching, he's using Torah to demonstrate Christ, to demonstrate that the Messiah has actually come. And where these accusations are coming from, where he's saying, don't circumcise your kids and all of this. No, he's not. He's saying, I'm not turning away from Jewish customs. You find to circumcise your kids. All I'm saying is don't insist on circumcision as being a means to becoming the people of God. That's just not what it is anymore. And so for Paul, that's his message to the Gentiles. You Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, don't have to do the Jewish customs in order to be the people of God. You Jews, carry on. That's fine. I've got no problem with you doing that. If you guys want to keep doing the Jewish customs so as to at least be integrated into the Jewish community, that's fine, but just don't insist on it as a means to becoming the people of God anymore. That's all I'm saying. And so what Paul's trying to do by sharing his testimony is to say that this is what I've discovered in this law. I'm passionate for the law, always have been, always will be, but what I've also discovered is that the promised Messiah has actually come, and I know that because of what I've experienced. I met Christ and his whole Damascus Road encounter and everything that he has experienced. I know that the Messiah has come, and so that's what I'm telling everybody about. I am 100% Jewish, 100% teaching Judaism, but as it's been fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. So then the purpose of the testimony is specifically that, is to at least clarify this chief accusation that Paul is anti-Moses. And so the best way to do that is just to say, it's not just to try to prove from Scripture or to argue from Isaiah that Jesus is the suffering servant or whatever you want to argue. It's to say, no, look, I'm telling you from my own experience. I'm telling you from what I saw. I'm telling you from the revelation that God has shown me and the transformation he's brought in my life, and from what he's consequently done in the Jewish people and what he's done in the way that this message has been spread. So he goes through all of that. Then verse 17, he finishes it up. He says, when I returned to Jerusalem, so this is after having met Jesus, having been blinded, and then Ananias coming and praying for him, and his returns. He says, when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying at the temple. I fell into a trance, and I saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that when I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you, and when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So there's one more element to Paul's testimony, which hopefully these Jewish people in this crowd are going to acknowledge, is that Paul, yes, he's been living out in the diaspora. Yes, he's been out preaching to the Jewish communities outside of Judea, but that was never Paul's intention. Paul actually wanted to stay in Jerusalem. Paul figured, I've been raised here. I know these people. They trust me. They know my story. Wouldn't it be a powerful testimony if they now see me as a follower of this new way, that I turn around and say, this Jesus who I was persecuting, these people who I was persecuting, they're actually right. They're correct. And wouldn't it be a great testimony if I was the one who said could turn around and now say, no, actually, I'm on these people's side. And if they see that transformation in me, then perhaps they're going to realize, hey, maybe there's something true about this. I mean, what better testimony could there be than me now becoming a member of this group that, up until last week, I was persecuting. So it seems like Paul's original desire was to stay, was to remain amongst the Jewish people and to be a brilliant testimony to the transformation of Jesus Christ, to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. What better testament could there be than Paul being the person who was converted over to this way? But then Jesus turns around and he says, no, it's not going to work that way. No, they're not going to accept your testimony. He says, but surely they are. Surely they'll see the transformation. Nope, they're not. That's just not how it's going to go down. Trust me. What I need you to do is get out of here, and I need you to go and preach to the Gentiles. And so it seems like in that early encounter that Paul has with Jesus is actually Paul wanting to stay, but Jesus being the one who sends him out to the Gentiles. So again, trying to explain to this crowd that not only is he not this anti-law apostate. He's actually fully on board with the law, that he just sees Jesus as being the fulfillment. But even the fact that he's out preaching amongst the Hellenistic Jews, out amongst the diaspora, wasn't even his decision. He wanted to stay local. He loved Jerusalem. He wanted to stay there. He wanted to be able to testify to those people that Jesus truly is the Messiah. So whatever has come about in his life wasn't even his fault. It wasn't even his desire. He sort of wanted the opposite of how things turned out. Now, in Paul's mind, that's a pretty good story, which in a way it is. I mean, that's a pretty decent testimony, and at least it gives something of a clarification over what these assumptions and accusations have been. This crowd is at least in a clearer mind now that he's not some foreign Greek-speaking Hellenistic Jew that's been, at the most, if you know anything about him, he's anti-law, anti-Moses. No, actually, he's much more local. He's an Aramaic speaker. He's clearly more one of us than we first assumed. But that also, it's not just that he's anti-law. He's actually, at least in his mind, is very pro-law, and to the extent that he sees the law being outworked in Jesus. So there's enough in the story to at least dispel a lot of the assumptions, a lot of the myths around this, or the false assumptions around him, or at least for the people that have got no idea why they're there, they've at least got some better sense of now who this guy is. Until he makes the mistake of, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. As we're about to find out in the next part of the story, that's the trigger. That sets the crowd off again. That, all right, you know what, he's whatever he might say about himself, all of that may be true, but he's still the enemy. He's still he's still somebody who's going to the Gentiles. The fact that you go out to the enemy, the cultural enemy, remembering that for the Jews, anyone who's a Gentile is a dog, they're unclean, they're somebody you don't associate with, and that's in an already angry mob who are looking for a reason to vindicate or justify their anger towards Paul. This is what they needed to hear. He went out and he lived amongst the dogs. He went and lived amongst the Gentiles. That sort of bias is perfectly fine in a place like Jerusalem. As the fact that Paul went out there, that's enough. That's you've a traitor to your people. You're an enemy to the people. You've gone out. You've lived amongst the unclean dogs. You are as bad as them. Every negative assumption or negative connotation about living amongst Gentiles, all of that has just hit the crowd in force, and is enough then to set them off again, to trigger the anger that we're about to see as this story continues. So that's going to pick up next week. But where we need to leave this story is, again, looking from the perspective of Claudius Lysias. He's been following on this story or following on Paul's testimony. He's still got no idea what's going on. Right, he's got a different assumption about who Paul is. Hopefully, by hearing Paul share his story, maybe he can pick up some further details, but that's been of no use because he's been speaking in Aramaic. So all Claudius Lysias has seen is Paul speaking to this, what was an angry crowd, but all of a sudden the crowd goes quiet because he speaks in Aramaic. It's like, well, that's different. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. The crowd's quiet, and then he sees them quietly listening. He's like, oh, what is he saying? Like, what is he telling these people that they're not wanting to kill him anymore, at least for the moment? So that's unusual. Again, he's only can work off the responses, can't understand what's going on. So what's going on in his mind? The crowd's quiet, they're not trying to kill him, that's something. And then all of a sudden, Paul doesn't say anything unusual. He doesn't necessarily raise his voice, or who knows? I mean, how Paul delivered it, we don't know. But all of a sudden, the crowd goes angry again, even more angry than they were before. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to go crazy. They're ready to tear Paul apart. He's like, what on earth did you just say to these people? One minute they're happy, one minute they're quietly listening to you. The next minute they're trying to kill you again. What the heck did you just say to them? And to make matters worse, this angry crowd is probably starting to edge forward towards their position, towards Paul and towards where Claudius is. He probably only has a handful of soldiers with him. He's like, all right, I've got to get you out of this situation to figure out what on earth is going on. That was a complete waste of time. That seems to have made matters worse. What on earth is going on here? Who are you? This is what we need to figure out. So what we'll look at next week is the interrogation. What happens next? Where does this story continue? And again, Claudius just trying to figure out, who are you? Who on earth are you that all of this trouble is happening around you? So anyway, we'll come back to that next week. Otherwise, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.